What interests me more than anything else when it comes down to stories of any variety is the element of the unknown, the mystery, the underlying ambiguity. This is especially true when said story is constructed specifically in a way so that it takes some sleuthing to discover the truth and the full extent of the lore, through providing cryptic clues or barely explained moments that have a through line just barely out of sight. If you've been around this channel, then you know I have a special affinity for the storytelling methods found in both Petscop and FNAF. And despite the two entities being very different from one another, they both utilize the ambiguous form of storytelling I was just talking about. And in this video, we're going to compare and contrast the two popular theory-based series to see just how much they stack up against one another. I will say as we begin that this video is not meant to determine which series is better or even which one I prefer, despite what the thumbnail may have implied. This is simply meant to analyze the similarities and differences in these two series that approach storytelling in a similar fashion under the horror genre. So, we'll start with a light overview of both series, as I'm sure the majority of watchers are familiar with both. Petscop is a YouTube channel devoted to documenting the various recordings of a video game called Petscop. It focuses on Paul discovering the game and delving into its many mysteries, and by paying close attention, one can derive a story that involves two main family bloodlines and the many tragedies that have occurred between them. I'm sure FNAF needs no introduction, but it's a very popular horror franchise that focuses on an unfolding story about a child serial killer and what becomes of his victims given the supernatural properties of this universe. Animatronics, ghost children, and killers in mascot costumes are the most recognizable attributes of this series. And on the topic of FNAF, I know there's a decade's worth of multimedia content, but to keep it more comparable to Petscop, we're going to exclude topics surrounding the books and movie and keep our focus zoomed in on the main draw, the games. Specifically, the Scott era games, when people really fell in love with the cryptic storytelling narrative that FNAF was going for. First, let's analyze where exactly all this ambiguity comes from. The writers behind these series have to purposely withhold information from us in order to maintain the mystery, and as such, writing decisions are deliberately made to both string us along and prevent us from having a 100% confirmed answer to many things. In Petscop, this stems from the fact that the in universe developer of the game, a man named Daniel Hammond, designed much of the darker and story rich parts of Petscop with specific people in mind. He doesn't need to give elaborate explanations or context. The intended player should be able to know exactly what he's driving at because they lived through the events he's imbued within Petscop. This works well because it gives a canon reason to why the game possesses such little context or anything like that, while also preserving the mystery for the audience. There are some gaps in Daniel's complete understanding of the events surrounding the families intertwined with Petscop. It seems he found out much of the history that transpired before he was involved through an investigation of his own, coming to conclusions himself and filling in some gaps based on his understanding. Furthermore, we see the Petscop game from different angles based on who is playing it. It's usually pretty obvious when Paul is the player, but thanks to the demo recording system, we can see past playthroughs by other people, and see different stages and evolutions of the game or what appears to be personalized copies geared towards them specifically. All of this works together for Petscop to have a definitive story of some kind, but to us outsiders, it is challenging to fully decipher in a way that makes complete sense. I think that's why Paul was such a fun companion, when he was actively talking at least, as in a way, we felt camaraderie with him. He only knew a little more than we did in the earlier videos, but his knowledge of the game does eventually surpass ours, especially when it comes to the people that presumably are forcing him to be in a confined room with the game running nonstop. In a meta sense, we also know that the creator Petscop has more fleshed out information created, specifically in the form of a website, but he ultimately decided not to release it for the sake of withholding what he believed to be too much specific detail. Honestly, I would put Peskov in the ARG category of things due to the puzzle adjacent nature that following the story is, but I know that some people disagree with that label being applicable to it. FNAF's ambiguity, I think, largely comes from the fact that it really got to be known for the lore hunters that were into the series, and the mystery became intrinsically entwined with its notoriety. Game theory and FNAF were booming in popularity at the time, and it seems they were very much feeding off of each other, engaging millions of gamers and viewers alike. Because of this, over the years, FNAF has gradually become more and more focused on telling a very confusing and cryptic story. And what's funny is, it does seem that at times when the creator thought he was perhaps giving some clarity, it actually ended up muddying the waters of the fanbase's interpretations even further. FNAF continues to be relevant in both the theorist space and the broader internet, so it does seem like it's here to stay for a while longer. And I think we can expect the story to stick to its characteristic interpretive style. Now that we've established the foundations and intentions behind the ambiguous storytelling found in each series, we can begin the more specific comparing and contrasting. One of the primary differences in the delivery of the lore in these two series is how the viewer is meant to perceive it. In Petscop, we are seeing a video game being played out and recorded, the footage and audio then later uploaded to YouTube. While the video game is often meant to reflect real, in universe events, thus requiring a certain level of translation into reality, the footage of Petscop is literal. We are seeing what we are seeing. These pixels and sequences are literally part of the game that Daniel created. Why I stress this point is that there are several times in the FNAF games that we can't be sure how accurate what we're seeing actually is. In the early days, and honestly right up through most of the FNAF games, minigames were a strong backbone for the lore delivery. The problem with these minigames is that the visuals within them are dubious. Obviously, reality isn't confined to 8-bit features, so therefore what we are looking at isn't a one-for-one reflection of the events that they are depicting within the FNAF world. However, unlike Petscop, these didn't necessarily have a canon reason for existing in this format. As such, theorists have to utilize many interpretational measures just to make these minigames make sense in themselves. Most times that isn't terribly strenuous to do, as there are typically obvious indicators and visual cues to communicate the intended message over to us. The similarity here is that both Petscop and FNAF use very abstract representations of events that are meant to have literally taken place in their worlds. Only Petscop made it clear from the beginning that someone with intimate knowledge of the main events of the story developed a game to specifically convey this, whereas with FNAF we just had to accept it as clues being fed directly to the audience. Petscop is very concerned with keeping everything about its existence immersed in its own world, giving in-canon reasons even for why it is being uploaded to YouTube in the first place. FNAF differs as many instances feel like they were meant only for the audience to see and aren't implied to exist in universe, at least not in the same way that we are perceiving it. This isn't even touching upon the several other avenues of sensory deception that FNAF has gradually introduced to the fandom over the years. Basically, FNAF has assembled itself with an arsenal of tools to pull fake outs by having an established explanation in stock for why what someone may have seen or experienced isn't really true. It was an illusion, it was a hallucination, it was induced by gas, it was a spirit realm possession magic called agony. You get the idea. Petscop has a different but conceptually similar counterpart to this as well, the running theme of unreliability in our narrators. While sensory manipulation and alteration aren't present within Petscop as far as I'm aware, the series plays off of themes of the perception of certain characters conflicting with absolute truth and the either intended or unintended deception that such confusion results in. Naturally, this is going to affect how the viewer interprets the story. What Marvin believes doesn't have to be true at all, what Daniel directly says might be skewed or flawed. This forces theorists to sort through dozens of supplementary details to corroborate or disprove basically any claim a character makes in this web series, not too dissimilar to how FNAF deep divers have to delineate how literal any event they witness truly is. I was mentioning earlier how both creators are careful about what information they choose to reveal to us at any given time for the sake of preserving the plausibility of multiple interpretations and the overall fun of the mystery. This method, while great for engaging an active community, can lend itself to a couple of complications as the narratives progress, implementing desired alterations to the lore as the storyline develops, or accidental miscommunication. FNAF theorizing has become a war zone for many reasons, one of which being the constant debates over what Scott Cawthon may have meant at one point in the time and how those previous details may have been reutilized to mean something else as time progressed. There's also the mythical one retcon that has loomed over discussions for a while, and plenty of people who believe other retcons may have been sneakily weaved in. A term known as ScottCon has been used in the FNAF community as well, basically referring to any time Scott shifted the true intentions for the lore, but in such a way that it didn't technically contradict anything already firmly established. All this taken into consideration, it seems likely that the story of FNAF has shifted at least a little bit over the years. I know a lot of fellow theorist YouTubers who believe FNAF 4 specifically pivoted from its original meaning with the release of Sister Location, and I think the box is the prime example of ever evolving story elements changing underlying lore elements. Petscop has less of this problem, in large part because it hasn't continuously run for 10 years and gotten tons of books and an official film complicating things, but its creator, Tony, has expressed how one of the difficulties of writing a series releasing installment by installment is that you have to adhere to previously established story beats, implying that there were certain elements that Tony either wanted to change or withdraw. I imagine these were very small things, as Petscop as a whole feels very pre planned and intricately connected. And I know one thing he explicitly labeled as abhorrent were the allusions to the Candace Newmaker incident found in the videos. Something I like to point out as feeling out of place in light of future videos is the synced duplicate moment when Paul enters Lena's room in the child library. This type of synchronization is never seen again and cannot be rationalized by later explanations like the others can. As such, I've concluded that it was added for ambiance at the time, and the fact that it breaks all future established through lines of Petscop synchronization wasn't really considered. In any case, these are further reasonings as to why these vague storytelling practices submerge fandoms so far into the weeds, sometimes even when not directly intending to do so. So far, we've discussed the withholding of information, the intentionally deceptive material, and the difficulties of handling progressive but vague narratives in relation to consistency and communication for both series, and how the writers and fandoms have navigated such things in their quest to either tell or solve a complicated story. The last thing I want to analyze is the strategy of clue giving in both of the series. In any piece of media that aims to be a mystery with no canonical confirmed solution, clues are difficult to properly execute. They need to have clear enough implications that it is theoretically possible for the audience to assemble them in such a way that the true narrative could be derived, but vague enough that it is by no means obvious and preferably difficult to come to a satisfying conclusion. So, how does both Petscop and FNAF handle this, and what are the similarities and differences? FNAF really likes Easter eggs, and the aforementioned minigames or other low context scenarios that provide lore insights can be delivered to you in a variety of ways, either by dying, progressing through the game, or triggering events through unlikely actions. Right away, it gives a sense of accomplishment for even discovering the clues, which is important to keep someone happily strung along. Beyond that, probably the main strategy is simply the lack of context. With the absence of a sensible explanation, the fans have come to their own conclusions based on the evidence that they can find in other areas of the game through careful analysis, also an experience that feels rewarding to succeed at. What quickly became a hallmark of FNAF is the idea of retroactive storytelling, which is delivering more elaboration or details on events that transpired before initial content that technically set up the foundation for the concept. Basically, chronological order conflicting with release date order. This greatly upholds the pattern of thrusting the player into a scenario with frustratingly little context, then drip feeding surrounding information predating the original scenario so conclusions can be discovered. Petscop heavily devotes itself to foreshadowing. As I stated earlier, I do believe pretty much all of Petscop's main narrative was carefully constructed before it was even released, and this is in large part due to the sheer amount of foreshadowing that is accomplished in just the second episode. This episode alone gives us so much that hints towards the future events in a coherent way, even from a retrospective standpoint, and this pattern is maintained throughout the 25 episodes that comprise the channel. In this way, it succeeds in giving clues that the viewers might not even realize were incredibly important to the story at hand until much later, but in hindsight, Petscop is creating the foundations for the true extent of its lore all along. Both Petscop and FNAF are popular among theorizers for a good reason, as they both utilize the hallmarks of cryptic storytelling in unique and continually intriguing ways. For every similarity shared between them, there's a different spin on the method that sets them apart enough to feel like entirely separate experiences to investigate. If you enjoyed this video, please help me out by giving it a like and commenting which of the series you have the most fun looking into in the section below. And if you like this type of investigative and storyline oriented content, subscribe to keep up with my regular video releases. I have an incredibly big video coming up in the next few weeks, but as for now, the unknown persists, so the investigation continues. And a huge thanks to my currently 2 channel members, Night Rain and Casual T, for being my most loyal detectives.